Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those in Europe. We will be getting started here in a few minutes, but we just want to give a little bit of time for those that are still joining, so just hang tight, and we should be started in about 2 minutes. Thanks. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Once again, I just want to thank everyone for joining us this morning, and those of y'all in Europe for taking the time to join us today for this webinar on FSLogix Apps and Office 365 Container for Citrix. Joining me today is Dave Young, Product Champion with FSLogix, and my name is Brandon Lee. I'm on the Solutions Marketing team here at FSLogix. So today, we're going to be covering our software, including the FSLogix 365 container. Here you can see a number of our customers, and you can also check out more at our website, FSLogix.com, and view some more of our case studies and learn how our customers are saving millions of dollars each year in IT. Here's just a quick page. Feel free to follow us on social media at FSLogix and on our Facebook page and LinkedIn page, and keep up with the industry experts and see what they have to say about FSLogix. Dave, if you want to go ahead and take it away.
All right. Well, thank you much, Brandon. So today we're going to talk about what FSLogix brings to the table as we start looking at virtual desktops, remote shared sessions, et cetera, et cetera. And there's been a lot of discussion in the industry over the last 20 years about a lot of different things. And ultimately, our industry's changing. I remember when I first put up my first presentation server, it was to solve a particular problem. I had an application that worked very well on the network, but as soon as we started putting it across the WAN, it didn't work very well. And that brought about a lot of challenges. That particular application was chatty. It was going to be expensive to rewrite it. And we looked at this thing called Citrix. right? And we implemented that, and ultimately what it did is it allowed us to keep the user close to the data, yet present the screen across the wire. And along with that came a lot of challenges, and we've all experienced them. We have applications that aren't designed to be in a shared environment. We have configuration problems. We have the fact that IT needs to do things to try and make the desktop that the machine is presenting non-persistent. And when we look at all those things, it has brought about a lot of challenges as we've progressed in this industry, and ultimately it has impacted our user experience. And why has it impacted our user experience? Well, there's things that we've had to do to make all this work that are not so good for a user. So when we talk about that, we'll talk about the IT desires, but we also need to remember what are the user's desires. So part of all this problem has been folder redirection or accessing things across the network. So some old friends of mine did a presentation many years ago. There's 100 things wrong in my VDI deployment, and 99 of them are related to VDI. Well, as we start to, or excuse me, not to VDI, but to folder redirection. So as we start to look at what we have done with folder redirection, it has caused us a large amount of pain. Why has it caused us so much pain? Well, folder redirection ultimately operates on what I call fetch and retrieve, right? I need to put a spreadsheet on the desktop for the user because the user saved it there. When they log in, I have to go fetch that document and copy it down or retrieve it down to the desktop. And all this has to take place during login. Now, there are some technologies that were pretty innovative at the day that said, hey, we're not going to actually fetch that document until Dave clicks on the icon. So we'll just present the icon, and then we'll worry about fetching the document later. And albeit 10 years ago, that was pretty cool, and that worked out really well, documents have gotten bigger, and we need to be realistic about where the user is impacted on that fetch and retrieve. Yeah, their login is going to be nice and fast, but if their login consists of downloading today's PowerPoint at 108 meg across the wire, well, somewhere they're going to have to wait for that. And so as we start to look at how fetch and retrieve impacts our architecture, we can now decide, well, is there newer technology that we need to look at? One more thing on that fetch and retrieve is, if you all remember back to your days of building fancy file servers, there's a math problem for determining the maximum number of file opens that a file server can support before it starts queuing. And as soon as a file server starts queuing, that means the user is waiting. So typical times that we'll see large queuing is, hey, everybody starts their shift at 8 a.m. and everybody hits, login at 8 a.m. So that's a very predictable time frame. We know it's going to happen, and we can design for that and spend lots of money, or we can say, you know what, we'll design for most of it and spend less money so that, the user gets a 35-second or a minute-and-a-half login versus a 15-second login. So as we talk about fetch and retrieve, we're going to talk about some of the things that FSLogix brings to the table to actually address that so that we can make it better for you. So there's things that we need to think about as we start to look at this. Today, things are changing dramatically. We've got Microsoft out there selling Office 365. And as we think about that whole Office 365 thing, this is the first time in my life that I have actually seen salespeople go directly to the CFO or sometimes the CIO and say, hey, you need to upgrade to Office 365 and bypass IT entirely. And that conversation goes like this: hey, you're due for an audit, and we think you might be out of compliance, and there's a hefty fine associated with that. But if you just upgrade to Office 365, you can pay as you go and only pay for what you need, and you'll be guaranteed you're not out of compliance. And the CFO says, well, I don't want to be out of compliance, and this paying as I go, that's pretty cool. I don't have to write a $1 million check today. I can pay $10,000, $100,000 a month instead. And that's a big difference in the way that the CFO is able to make these payments. So as we start to think about that budgetarily wise, they're selling high. And then what happens is we start rolling this out, and it rolls out to desktops first, and along comes our XenApp or our VDI environments. And all of a sudden we get the famous phrase, and I'm going to clean it up as much as I can, but you can substitute your own words. Citrix stinks. VMware View stinks. Whatever other product you're using stinks. And the user's saying this because all of a sudden their user experience is not what they expect it to be. So I'm not sure if many of you have tried Office 365 online. Yeah, you can run a wonderful client and all that good stuff. And when you look at it across the wire in a shared environment, it performs pretty poorly from a user experience. Things are choppy. You got to wait for mail. You got to, slow in search. Sometimes Outlook just freezes because it's trying to look for something. And overall, from a user experience, it's very, very poor. So these are things that we need to think about, right? So one of the things, as we think about this, that people want to do is to make that user experience better, is they want to use cache mode. And cache mode is basically just copying the data local so that we can execute against that. Well, the problem with that from an IT perspective is I need to put that file somewhere. And just so everybody knows, the default size for a OST or mailbox size on Office 365 is 50 gig. And if you call Microsoft and say I ran out of space, they'll give you more. They don't really care. It's cheap for them. So when we start thinking about that, all this data needs to have something done with it. So if we cache it on a local Citrix server, or VDI machine, or RDSH session, well, now I have multiple users, and we'll just go with a simple, easy number. I've got 10 users on an RDSH server with 50 gig files. I'm going to need a lot of disk space. And as we think about the impact of that, well, what happens when the user logs into a different RDSH server, right? They have to recreate this 50 gig file. Or we go do something crazy that I don't recommend doing, but we go out and we put it on a file share. So we redirect that OST out onto a file share, and from a admin perspective, it's okay. It works out fairly well when 2 or 3 users are testing it, but when you throw 30, 100, 1,000, 10,000 users at it, it really starts to fall down. So we get into this situation where we have to think about what's going to be happening, right? And not to mention, we have impact on our CPU, we have network impact, right? We now have to start to look at our I/O, what we're doing there, and we have to consider, how is this going to impact my environment? Can I have Office 365 across the board, or do I need to silo it out, which starts to add to my complexity? And next thing you know, the IT team is not so happy with the CFO's purchase, right? But guess what? CFO pays our bill, so we need to make sure that we can make this happen. So let's talk about a little bit more of the things on how FSLogix can help with the implementation. So we have our products. We have several products, but we're going to talk about the main ones. We have profile containers. We have our Office 365 container, and we have apps and Java product, right? So we're going to talk about each one of those and kind of help you see how this will impact your implementation so that you can have success. So let's talk about the profile containers first. So earlier we talked about that fetch and retrieve technology. FSLogix has a new way of doing things. We don't use fetch and retrieve. We use virtual hard disk, right? And we have built our driver so that when the user logs in, we pull a whole bunch of information together, and voila. The user and the machine thinks that CUser's %username is local. And when we talk about that, let's talk about the impact on performance. I don't think anybody on the phone would argue with me that opening a file locally is much faster than opening a file across the network, right? There's different technologies. We've got to pull it down, open it, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas when I open a file locally, what happens is I actually read the blocks and sectors on the disk to represent that file. I don't have to load the whole thing into memory or onto disk. So it changes what we're doing. And from an end user perspective, we no longer have to build that desktop when they connect, because what we're going to do is we're going to magically connect them to see users %username with a VHD so that all that stuff just appears there. I was doing a test with a customer a couple weeks ago, and we got him all set up with this, and he says, Dave, if your stuff is as good as you say it is, we're going to find out. And he copied 2 movies, okay? They were Batman movies, onto the desktop and logged off. And he's like, wow, log off's pretty quick. And then he logged back in, and login was pretty quick. And he says, your stuff is as good as you say it is. Now, if we think about fetch and retrieve, if I had 2 4-gig movies on the desktop and I had to pull those down, right, the user would have been waiting for that data to get pulled down before they were actually successfully logged in. So let's talk a little bit more about how that particular session was impacted. So the next thing he did was he launched one of the movies. I had this aha moment. If I was a user and launched one of those movies, I'm literally copying 4 gigs into temp, right? And then I'll read it from temp, and then we'll discard it, right? Windows does a great job managing that, but I'm technically copying data into temp. Whereas with our technology, what we were doing is we were going across the network and reading the blocks that were in the movie that we actually needed to see. So the first thing that comes up was pick your language. Well, he happened to be in Canada, so it was English and French was the 2 languages he could pick from. So he chose English, and the movie starts playing. And this is where my aha moment came in. We don't have to read the French stuff. All we have to do is read the English version of the movie. And we read that as we go, and we're able to present that data on the fly because we're talking at block level technology versus file level technology. So the amount of traffic is immediately cut in half because I don't have to read the entire DVD. I only have to read those blocks that I actually need. So that really changes what we're doing when it comes down to our login. So the other thing it allows us to do is eliminate a lot of that folder redirection that we unnecessarily need, right? The desktop, the my apps, my this, my that, all this stuff that we have redirected to try to make the machine as non-persistent as we can. So this gives us that ability to make sure that those items are brought to the user just in time at a pretty cool layer, which is really disk technology layer. So let's talk about how Office 365 plays into all this. So if I have Office 365 and I decide I need to deploy with a local OST, we now have a management problem where we have to decide, does that OST need to be on the network? Do I make my user sticky to the XenApp server or the RDSH server? What do I do, right? Well, with our technology and this folder interception, mapping the drive to a VHD or the folder to a VHD, what we're able to do is say, hey, allow that data to be written once and roam with the user from machine to machine to machine. And as we do that, that allows us to not have to reproduce data just because it's good for the user's experience. And it allows us to start to manage our apps differently. You're going to see how when we pull this all together with our app solution, what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, you've got Office 2013 installed on your XenApp or RDSH or VDI environment, and we need to plan our migration over to Office 365 from 2013 to Office 365. Well, we can do that off the same infrastructure. No need to build new environments because what we're able to do is we're able to mask that application away from the user. And by masking initially Office 365 away from the user, we can present Office 2013, and when we're ready to migrate that user, we can flip them over by just changing a permission. I move the user from one AD group to another AD group, so they move from the Office 2013 group to the Office 2016 or Office 365 group, and magically when they log in, they're now able to see Office 365. And if, somebody missed the training on how to use Office 365 and we needed to migrate them back, we're literally just pulling that person's name and putting them in the Office 2010 group instead of the Office 365 group. A couple things that we want to actually make sure we're paying attention to, right, is the way that Microsoft has licensed this. So one of the things that they do is they do entitlement. So the user will log in and validate their license against a Microsoft server. So that particular piece, if we are doing non-persistent, for the user environment becomes very painful for the user, because in order to launch any Office 365 product, they're going to have to re-entitle themselves. And the unfortunate part is setting up single sign-on for this is pretty difficult. Good thing to know is, FSLogix has developed a solution for this, and we can help with that. The next thing that's going to happen in this whole environment is, once we get mail working, is the users are going to want to save data. And the other side to this story that Microsoft is telling the CFO, where they can capture a lot of savings, is, hey, you don't have to manage file servers anymore. We'll put it all in OneDrive, and you can have a terabyte per user space, and they can access it from anywhere, and it's wonderful. It's better than sliced bread. Well, let's think about this from the user experience. So all of a sudden, I'm on my XenApp server or my RDSH server, and I need to open a presentation. Well, now I have to navigate to OneDrive, fetch that file across the network, okay, which is going to impact your firewalls and your network bandwidth, and then I can manipulate it. And then when I want to save it, I do the same thing in reverse, and it becomes very painful for the end user. The user wants to drop down to, my documents and save something and be done with it, right? They don't want to have to go through this very painful fetch and retrieve. Well, the next step to that is, we'll let you have a local OneDrive cache. Well, as I start to look at that, we're once again into the same predicament that we were in with OSTs. Where do I want to put this, right? Try installing OneDrive over whack server name share. It just doesn't let you do it. It wants to put it on a local disk. So as we start to think about that, we need to have good tech to enable us to do that without actually putting it on the logical disk that exists on the machine, because that doesn't allow us to have non-persistence of the machine and persistence of the user. So now we're up to our challenge with OneDrive. And just so everybody knows, OneDrive default size is a terabyte, right? So when we start to think about that, that's a lot of data that we are going to have to accommodate. So our part of our design says, hey, let's cache that, right? So the warning I give you now is, don't throw away all your file shares and file servers because Microsoft sold you OneDrive. You're going to need that. We're going to repurpose that so it can be temporary storage or low-performing storage, so they can host these cache files so that we can have better performance for the end user and they will be happy. We won't need near as much management on it because the OneDrive data and the OST data is reproducible data. It can be discarded in the event of an emergency where something happened to it, and we can allow it to rebuild. So let's talk a little bit about unified base image management, because this is going to play into that whole migration phase for you. So we're, with our technology, and I'll show you how it works here in a minute, we're able to reduce the number of images. So let's use Office for an example. And I have one silo for Office 2010, one silo for Office 2013, and one silo for Office 365/2016. Well, if I was able to put all those applications on the same silo, coexisting, I would be able to reduce the amount of silos I have by 2/3, right? From 3 down to 1. And by reducing that, I can now say, hey, instead of designing for 50% utilization across 9 servers, I can design for 50% utilization maybe across 5 servers or 4 servers. It really depends on what your load is. But I'm not going to need 9 servers to handle all that, because I can now do greater things based off of density. Okay, and this is going to help you with eliminating the problems that we're seeing around application virtualization. A little my history and where I'm coming from. I was a founding member of the VDI team for VMware. I had done a lot of consulting prior to that around SoftGrid. I am actually a SoftGrid certified architect number 3, right? Went to the class, got the certificate, and did a lot of SoftGrid, or Softricity at the time, of deployments. And I did a lot of thin-stall deployments. And I used that technology to help companies solve problems. The problem with that technology, albeit it was the best that we had at the time, the problem was they tried to follow the path that VMware had set on virtualization. Containerize everything into a single file and isolate it away from other components so that we can have isolation away from the true operating system. That was what they tried to do with virtualization around servers. Isolate everything into a file and isolate it or separate it away from the physical hardware. Well, that doesn't work very well in apps. If anybody has ever done any app V or XenApp stuff, it's tough. There's a lot of things that you have to figure out. So when I was consulting, I'll tell you this story about my biggest win that I never won. It's going to make me a millionaire. I went to this large financial institution. They were interested in app virtualization, did a big assessment for them, did a big presentation, and got down to nuts and bolts. And they said, well, Dave, how much is this going to cost? And I said, well, I like to plan 4 hours per app on average. And I said, okay. And they said, how much do you bill? And I said, well, I bill $125 an hour for my team. And they're like, okay, so for one app, we're at $250, $500. Okay, that's not bad. And I said, how many apps do you have? And they said, well, we have 10,000 apps. And in my mind, I went, cha-ching! I'm going to get rich. 10,000 apps times 4 hours, that's 40,000 man hours that I'm going to bill, right? This is awesome, right? I am cha-chinging it, right? And they did that same math, and they said, so Dave, what you're telling us is this is going to cost us about $2 million. And I said, uh-huh. And they said, yeah, we're not doing that. And my cha-ching went to chug, right? And the reason being is all that complexity around virtualizing those applications became very, very limiting. So with FSLogix and what we do, I can isolate or mask, there's a word I prefer to use, an application away from the operating system in about 10 minutes. And that's if I have a cup of coffee or two in between. Install your application natively. We run our tool, which allows us to basically spider that application, figure out all the things that it's touching, and create an uninstall manifest. What do I need to hide from the operating system so that the application no longer exists? What do I need to do to uninstall an application so it no longer exists? Two very, very similar actions. So by doing this, we're now able to isolate and present to the user just in time the application that they're entitled to. The next thing that we have, we'll talk real quick about, is Java. When we talk about Java, I don't know a company out there that doesn't have some sort of Java problem. And let's talk about why we have Java problems. Internally, we may be very, very lucky that we have all of our Java upgraded to one version. That's great, but reality is customers go external, and when they go external, we have no control over the versions of Java that other companies use. So a great example, I'm doing something and I need to go to nasa.gov. Well, nasa.gov, they have invested, billions of dollars into one of their websites, and it runs on, and we're just going to throw out a random version of Java 1.1, right? They haven't upgraded it, nor do us as taxpayers want them to keep that updated in regards to the Java version they're using, because we'd be paying, out the yin-yang every month when a Java update comes out. So customer needs to go out, Java 1.1 and highly insecure, but we trust the nasa.gov site. So what do? Do I allow them to do that? Do I make them uninstall, reinstall? Do I make them go to a different machine? It just starts to bring problems to IT. So with our solution, what we're able to do is we're able to go in basically at a security level and say, hey, here's the 15 sites that I trust, nasa.gov, java.com, whatever these sites are, and I can get very specific on the sites that I trust and tell it what version of Java we want it to use. So I would say nasa.gov 1.1, java.com 1.8, right? And then when the user launches their application, they're able to use the appropriate version of Java for that application without having to do anything from a user perspective and without IT having a loss of security. Because now when I go to a bad website that I didn't intend to go to and it's running insecure Java that we don't trust, I won't be able to use that insecure Java. So it allows us to maintain that very simply, 5 minutes to implement, and I can now have the ability to make sure users get the appropriate version of Java without having any impact on their day. Let's talk a little bit about how all this stuff optimizes what we're doing, right? So XenApp, app virtualization, app V, whatever you want to call that technology, has a little bit of overhead, okay? Part of that overhead is the fact that I have to put it into a bubble. I have to, isolate it away from the operating system. I have to make sure that all my up and down and cross from one application to another application is able to work. With our solution on the application piece of it, it is native. Okay, so we're no longer having to go from one application to another and make sure all that stuff works because it runs natively on the machine. It's not contained within a bubble. Folder redirection versus what FSLogix is doing, right? You're going to see significant I/O reduction, reduction of CPU on your systems, and a reduction of the impact on search. Okay, and we're going to talk about search in depth here soon, which means I can up my session density. Right? I can go from 20 users per machine to 24 users per machine. And if you have a large environment, updating your density by 20% is a huge savings. If you've got 1,000 users and you're able to automatically, because you changed some tech, support 1,200 users, that means less network ports, it means less storage ports, it means less rack space. I mean, there's all these things that it means less of, which is real money, okay? And we can return profiles like users want them and login times to the user at the same time, right? So we're going to talk about a little study that I did. I did a test environment. Our CEO, Kevin Goodman, calls me up one day. I get cautious on his calls now. He calls me up one day and he says, Dave, I want you to prove, so we can do a demo and a discussion on this, how we impact the user's login. And I said, okay. So went together, put together a test environment. Ultimately, what we did is we monitored it with Uber Agent. If you want to see the whole presentation, you can just Google Uber Agent, FSLogix, and you'll see the presentation. But what we ended up doing is I created a desktop that I lived in for about a week. So I did all the wrong things I knew I shouldn't have done, right? Like I saved things to the desktop, I had files, I had data, I had all this stuff that, a user would do. And as we started to use that, right, we started to see the impact on it. And everything I did to make that desktop like a user, because I was the user, I actually put into a batch script so that I could make that identical on the other machine. So every byte, every file is the same. It's the same identical user desktop. And it's actually the same physical, logical desktop that we're coming from, just an alternate login. And FSLogix is enabled. So when we look at it, without FSLogix, our login time was 42.98 seconds. 42 seconds. That's what our login time is. When I replace traditional roaming profiles with FSLogix, we drop down to roughly 8 seconds. That's huge. That is absolutely huge. And you will see that those login times will be consistent. Now, there's a couple qualifying factors, and I've got to give you all. If you have login scripts running that does this, does that, we're not going to impact that. What we're truly impacting is the time to copy data. Okay, so if you've got a lot of folder redirection, a lot of roaming profile problems, we're going to eliminate that because we're no longer fetching and retrieving. We're only connecting the user. And when we look at scalability, the part of the test I did is I scaled this out more and more users, right? So the red line is traditional roaming profiles. And every time I would run a login session, you can see those spikes, okay? So my performance continuously got worse, okay? And the big spike in the middle, I actually had to physically reset the environment because I had put so much load on it that it locked up the whole thing. Now, you can see our green spike. We were actually impacted by that because file server just couldn't handle the amount of traffic coming at it. right? So, it had all these wait queues up, and we ended up falling into that wait queue. But if you look at the average line, right, the linear line, you'll see that ours changes very much, or very little when under load, whereas the traditional roaming profile changes pretty drastically when under load. So the ultimate of that is we are able to greatly improve your user's login and performance and greatly reduce the amount of I/O contention that you're going to have on your storage. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. One of the things that we as architects and engineers have done is we have followed what were at the time industry best practices. And those industry best practices weren't always geared towards the user, okay? So there's two sides of this camp. There's us in IT, we'll call that the IT desires, and there's the actual end user, who's our customer desires. So one of the things we in IT want is we want maximum session density, we want non-persistence, so if something happens to the machine, I don't have to recover a whole bunch of stuff, and we don't want the users to have a very good life. I'm kidding about the users not having a very good life, but what we do impacts them. So a good friend of mine, Jack McMichael, right? He wrote a great thing for VMware, and it's how to optimize, RDSH and Windows Virtual Desktops for VDI. And one of the things that's in that is disable search. And so, because search hits CPU high, it's got to recreate every time the user logs in. It's just not good for a VDI environment. And at the time, that was the best answer people had to maintain density. Also, another good friend of mine, Brian Madden, wrote another very similar article, okay? And at the time, these were the right answers because we had nothing else that we could do in regards to this. Now, in all fair disclosure, Brian Madden is now a member of our technical advisory board and an investor in FSLogix, okay? He saw what we were doing was impacting a lot of the problems that he had wrote about personally, right, and talked about personally, and he has decided to invest in the company. So, an industry analyst like that, in my mind, that sees what we're doing is pretty big. So, what's new with FSLogix? Search. That's a big buzzword right now. Search is very, very important. We have two phases of search. There's single user mode, which is usually around VDI, okay? And then there's multi-user mode, which is usually around XenApp, RDSH, et cetera, et cetera. Now, single user mode search for us was a simple problem to solve. We did it. It was no big deal. Out it went. Multi-user mode was a little more difficult. So we're going to talk about what we did in multi-user mode and what you'll see and all that good stuff. So let's talk about the limits, right? Currently, search index is disabled, right? We have no cache. You can use instant build, right? And if you use instant build, you're going to see some unpredictable user experiences, okay? And why do we have unpredictable user experience? Well, we have network traffic that has to be generated. We have things that are hosted outside of us, and all of a sudden our machine is going to see a huge spike in CPU. And you can watch what I'm going to show. I'm going to show you just a screenshot of this, but I actually have full video. If you want to watch it, just drop us a note. But if you look at this, this is me doing search through Outlook 2016 using the queries against the online servers. Now, one would think that if I did that, I wouldn't use any local CPU. Well, it does. So if you look there at the top and on the right of the performance, that is search being spiked up. And you notice it hangs right around 35%. It will actually stay there and churn data, okay, at 35% until I exit the search window, right? So that's a huge impact on our system. And you multiply that times 10 users, 20 users, 30 users, whatever you have, that's going to eat up a lot of CPU, okay? And look at that network traffic. That's it going out there and talking, and then we have a lot of disk I/O, okay? So you'll see very poor performance when you use online search or what's considered Outlook search against the Office 365 servers. Now let's talk about the FSLogix solution. So what we do is we persist the search index for the user. Okay, we are independent of other profile solutions. You can use us with our solution. You can use us with roaming profiles. You can use us with UPM. You can use us with AppSense, Res, Liquidware. We don't care. You can use our search technology with any of those other UEM or profile management tools. Okay. What you're going to get out of this is a predictable user experience, right? You'll see a significant reduction in CPU utilization, which means we're going to get more density, right? If I have, if I remove a large amount of CPU cycles, that means I can put more users on there, and we're going to reduce your network traffic. So let's take a look at the same search function with FSLogix. So now you see spikes. Okay, so each one of those 3 spikes in the first row on the right are me implementing different search terms. So I use the phrase diamonds are forever. That's what I'm searching for. And when I search for diamonds are forever, you'll see I did diamonds, and then I added are, and then I added forever. And our traffic and our CPU utilization is much different. You see little spikes as it executes the query against the Windows search database file that we're maintaining, and then it drops right off. You don't see that continuous hang at 35% utilization as it continues to look through, the online exchange servers for data. So dramatic difference in what we're doing. So let's compare all this just so that we have a good eye on it. You can see that the online search is the blue line. It's high and consistent, whereas the FSLogix search is a instantaneous impact and then drops off. So as we start to think about that, that definitely changes how we're designing, right? We can accommodate those spikes. We don't want to have consistent CPU utilization. So let's kind of wrap up and conclude on this. So the legacy methods, right? Unpredictable, users not happy, right? And the typical thing that happened was shut search off, right? IT wasn't happy with the impact, the user's not happy with the impact, so we shut search off. That is not what the end user wants. As I tried to justify this to our VP of sales when we first started looking at this, he said, Dave, I don't get it, what's the big deal, right? And now he's not technical, his name's Andy. And I said, Andy, here's how big of a deal it is. Go into Outlook and look for that email I sent you about customer XYZ. And he said, okay. And I said, but don't use search. And he said, well, that'll take hours. And I said, exactly. That's the impact. So as we think about that from a user perspective, not good. Let's talk about what FSLogix brings to it. It roams with the user, right? Very light impact on the CPU. And the user is going to be happy because they actually have search, right? Go figure, the user's happy with what something IT did, right? They're actually going to be able to do search. It's going to perform well for them, and it's going to be an experience like their legacy desktop, laptop that they used to have. So I want to take a pause for a moment. I've done a lot of talking. I want to open up the line for Brandon to ask me questions that have come in. And we'll answer a few questions, and then we'll wrap up for the day. So, Brandon, give me the first question that you got.
Well, real quick, Dave. So on these slides, it's talking about Outlook search for XenApp. Just want to get some clarification. Is it only for XenApp? You did mention RDSH.
Yeah, so sometimes Dave assumes everybody knows what Dave is talking about. It's a good question. When we say XenApp, we support RDSH, RDS, whatever you want to call it, single terminal servers or XenApp servers or any other technology that is using a terminal session type technology to do multi-user presentation, multiple users on a single desktop. And it's also important to make sure that we clarify we are only addressing search and Outlook at the moment. We're not saying take the entire Windows terminal server search index and roam that. And the reason that we're saying that is generally we don't want the users having data on that local RDSH server. We want them to save it out on the network, and we don't want them to have a sense of ownership on that local machine. And we also support VDI across the board, okay? Whether it's, VMware or Citrix or, man, I can't even remember. I remember when LeoStream used to have a broker. Whatever broker you're using, we're independent of that. What we do need is Windows 2012 for RDSH terminal servers or Windows 8 and above for VDI. Okay, those are our limitations. Hopefully that clears that up, and we'll go on to the next question.
All right, I've got another question in here, and this actually refers back to our app masking piece. How do you patch all the different applications?
So ultimately, here's the way Dave likes to do it, and there's many ways to skin a cat, but I like to create my, my master image, and I do a typical application install. So we'll use Office for the example. So I go and install Office 2010. I take an extra 15 seconds, I create my mask rule, and I hide Office 2010. And I hide it from Dave, right? And I log back into the machine, and I have what appears to be a clean machine. And I go ahead and install Office 2013. Take the extra 15 seconds to create the mask rule, and I hide it from Dave. And then I log back in, and I go look at, add remove programs, and I see that there's nothing there. There's no Office 2010. There's no Office 2013. So then I install Office 2016. I take the extra, we'll call it 20 seconds for 2016, and mask it, and I hide it away from me. So then when it comes time to do application updates, I can take Dave Young's ID and move it in the appropriate Active Directory group for 2010, 2013, or 2016, see the application, do updates to it, update my masking rule, and then hide the application again. So that the only time I'm seeing it is when I'm actually entitled to it. So that gives us the ability to have different versions hidden away from the operating system so that we can manage that application. One other thing to talk about on that is I may have plugins for different groups, right? So let's say I've got Outlook 2013 with a couple plugins. Finance's plugin is different than HR's plugin, all right? Well, typically that causes us problems. So what we do is we open it up and we create a rule, masking rule for that plugin, and then we create a finance AD group, and we entitle people, and we create an HR AD group, and we entitle people, so they see their stuff when they need to. So it's a different way of managing the application. I would tend to say it's like going back 20 years, right, where we installed everything locally, and every user had their own unique environment. But we've used 20 years worth of tech to make that work in a VDI or a hosted environment where we have multiple users doing things.
All right, I think that answered the question. So actually, we got another question here, and asked by a few different people. How about resizing the VHD? For example, is it possible to shrink the VHD where there's excess space? What is our default sizing?
Got it. So VHD management, let's cover that first. FSLogix is doing no magic to the VHD. We are leveraging Microsoft technology for VHDs. We're leveraging everything they've done around VHDs. So they own VHDs, VHDXs. We're leveraging that industry technology, okay? The magic that we're doing is the automation of creating, the masking of where it appears to be, all that stuff around user and IT management. So when it comes down to the VHD, we can dynamically grow VHDs. We can grow them as large as Microsoft or the technology will support. The largest one I've ever seen is 4 terabytes. That was a unique situation. But that VHD, when we create it dynamically, it initially starts off at like 2K. And then as data is written, it grows. Now, the part that everybody gets hurt by is all of a sudden I've got a user that has, we'll use 4 terabytes as an example, of space, and we find out that they installed iTunes on their machine. And they pulled down 2 terabytes worth of iTunes stuff. And IT finds this out, and they tell the user, you can't do that, delete it. So they do. Well, the user's VHD has grown to, we'll call it 2.01 terabytes, and it's going to stay there. There are tools out there, use the industry tools, where you can mount that and issue a shrink, and it will reclaim that space. We are looking at, and this is a little future stuff, no guarantees of when or if it'll actually deliver, but we're looking at tools to automate that. We want to automate lots of things. Hey, if I've got a user's VHD that has excess space, maybe once a week I want to go in and reclaim that excess space. Take it back so there's no excess space in the VHD. Or maybe, you know what, I started out with 5 gig and realized it needs to go to 50 gig, right? So having some automation, server-side tools that'll run, we would go through and say, hey, expand these all automatically. Or maybe I want to take a more conservative approach because I want to control my growth, and I want to start out with 5 gig and always have 10% capacity available, right? So what I would do is I would be able to set some parameters, and every night or once a week we'd run through and we'd say, hey, there's Dave Young's VHD. He doesn't have 20% available. Let's expand it. Let's make it 5.4 gig or 5.9 gig, whatever it is, and we'll expand it out automatically so that the user doesn't have to call and place a support ticket, and IT doesn't have to manage that individually. Hopefully that clears up those pieces of conversation.
Yeah. So what about a situation where a user needs multiple profiles, like say they're logging in from one machine and then they decide to go somewhere else and log in from another machine?
So multiple profiles, and I assume you're asking, let's say I'm going from Windows 7 to Windows 10, right? Let's be really, really clear on this. VMware does not transfer, or VMware, man, after 10 years, you'd think I'd stop doing that. FSLogix, nor VMware, transform that profile from a version 1 to a version, I think it's 7 profile. We don't do that. What we will allow is the user to have multiple profiles exist in their VHD. And by having that happen, you can actually go from Windows 7 to Windows 10. We don't transform the profile, and they don't have a single profile. They literally do have 2 profiles, but we allow them to be stored in a common place. So if I have data, I could actually go browse into my old profile and grab my data and access it.
All right, so got another question here about referring back to the resizing. Are there any VHD resizing tools that are third-party tools that are supported by FSLogix?
We're agnostic on that one. I've got customers that are doing it with Perl scripts. I got customers that bought, or not bought, but got some kind of freeware tool. We technically don't really care as long as it does, the proper, actions against the VHD. That support would really probably be more towards, does Microsoft support these third-party tools for managing VHDs?
All right, and here we got another one. Are there any known issues with OST files when failing over the storage?
There's lots of known issues with OST files. One of the things we'll talk about, one of the things we introduced last year, which is our high availability framework. So one of the things that we monitor on the operating system is VHD disconnects, right? If for some reason you get disconnected from your storage, we want to reconnect you. Okay, we don't want the user to have to call IT and say, hey, I got disconnected from the storage. We want that to all happen automatically, right? So we have a couple settings. We call them retry attempts and retry intervals. I personally like to use 120 attempts at 5 seconds. And that's generally enough where if you have to bounce a file share, from one cluster node to another, reboot a controller, and there's a little bit of transition, we're going to have the most limited impact on the user. What we don't don't support. Very important. I got maintenance to do tonight, and I'm going to shut down my file share for 6 hours, and I want my user to automatically be able to use everything that was in the file share. That is not what our HA is about. It is about automatically reconnecting the user to that VHD so that they can have a continued user experience.
Automagically indeed. Well, I think that unless there are any other questions out there from the audience, feel free to ask them now.
And, you know, Brandon, we always have people that want to talk to us directly. Kick it. Is it really as good as we think it is, et cetera, et cetera. And they are more than welcome to drop us a note, to get in contact with us. Drop us a note at sales@fslogix.com. And one of our salespeople will get back to you. We can set up a proof of concept for you. Generally, for profiles and OSTs or Office 365, we can get that up and running in less than an hour for you. That's training, making sure you know what's going on. And then on the app side, generally within an hour, we can have you with a good level of knowledge so you can go do some play and come back with additional questions. Sometimes the hardest part about the whole apps piece is getting our new customer to change the way they think about things. And, you know, we've had beaten into our heads for going on 10 years at virtualization and all that good stuff, and now we need to change the way we think about things. So helping you get through that transformation of doing it the old way to doing it a different way usually takes a couple sessions, but after that, most of our customers are off and rolling with no issues.
Great, and I think that's a good point to go ahead and wrap up with. Thanks to everyone for joining us today, and we want to wish everyone a great afternoon. So thanks again, and have a good one.